With next year being the 30th anniversary of the Resident Evil franchise, I wanted to make a video talking about my top 10 favorite cinematic cutscenes that we have seen throughout this series. Now, there are so many just really good scenes throughout Resident Evil, and so it was kind of difficult to narrow it down to just 10, but I do think I got it. But having said all that, since there are so many just wonderful scenes throughout this series, I did want to give a few quick honorable mentions before we dive into the top 10. So let's go ahead and get started with that. Alright, so to start off these honorable mentions, we have the original Resident Evil 3 where Nemesis first appears. I really love this scene because it really is impactful and showcases just the sort of threat that Nemesis is going to be. The way he instantly kills Brad and then goes after Jill. It's very iconic, it's very memorable, it really sets up the tone of this game, and I love that you get the option to either fight him or run away into the police station, so I had to put in the honorable mentions. Up next, we have the original Resident Evil 4, Leon versus Ada. I love this scene, being a huge Leon Ada fan, as you will see when we get to our top 10 list. This was just a really cool moment in the original Resident Evil 4. I love the slow motion that it has, Leon going for his knife, Ada trying to retrieve her gun. It's just a really cool moment, and it's the first time since the original Resident Evil 2 that these two characters reunite. So this has to be thrown into the honorable mentions. Alright, so up next we have Resident Evil 5, where Chris and Sheva go up against Wesker. I like this action scene in particular because it just has a lot of cool cinematics to it. Wesker throwing the sunglasses and it's in slow motion, and he proceeds to beat up on Chris and Sheva and then put back on the sunglasses. It's just really good stuff that goes on right there. And then I like his little speech about how he's not destroying the world, he's saving it. And then, furthermore, this scene was actually used in the live action movie Resident Evil Afterlife, so definitely deserves an honorable mention. And finally, to cap off the honorable mentions, we have none other than the original 1996 Resident Evil with the iconic Jill sandwich cutscene. This is by far one of the most memorable quotes within Resident Evil lore, and it's referenced in other games like Revelations 2, so I absolutely had to put it in here. Any cutscene featuring Barry from the 96 Resident Evil is going to be gold, but this scene in particular is just the most iconic and memorable, so it'd be an injustice not to add it here somewhere. Now, with that being said, that is the end of the honorable mentions. Let's go ahead and dive into the main list. Alright, so to start off this top 10, we have Resident Evil 3 Original, The Destruction of Raccoon City. This is just a hugely impactful moment within Resident Evil. I mean, this is the end of an era. Resident Evil 1 through 3, this is how it all closes off, the original trilogy, The Destruction of Raccoon City. It's such an impactful moment. We see Jill and Carlos escape in a helicopter by none other than Barry Burton piloting the chopper. And so it's just a really cool moment seeing Barry show back up. But I love the cinematics of this scene. Like, you see the missile in the air, and then when it makes impact and the city begins to get destroyed, you just see it from different angles where these buildings are getting completely blown away, and the history of Raccoon City dissolves away. It's a huge moment. It's not a very long scene or anything like that. It's really like a minute, if that. But it's so impactful to the lore of Resident Evil. Like, this sets up so much of what we see afterwards. Like, the destruction of Raccoon City eventually leads to the fall of Umbrella, and that introduces bioterrorism, which becomes a huge point in the sequel trilogy of Resident Evil. So this scene right here, although not very long, is hugely impactful to the overarching lore of Resident Evil, and so I absolutely love it. It's unfortunate that the remake did not really capture it as well as the original did, but nonetheless, the original 1999 cutscene of Raccoon City's destruction is by far one of the best scenes in Resident Evil, and that is why I have it here at number 10. Let's go ahead and move on to number 9. At number 9, we have the original Resident Evil 2, where Claire Redfield meets Police Chief Brian Irons. I love this scene because it introduces a different type of horror vibe. Up until this point, you've been facing zombies and liquors and things of that nature. But once you step into the police chief's office, you are met with an unsettling type of horror, a creepy horror, because it's just a normal guy, but he's very unsettling. The fact that the first time you meet him, he has the body of the mayor's daughter just laid out on his desk, and then he starts talking about how beautiful her skin is, but that it will soon putrefy and she'll become a zombie within the hour. It's just really unsettling. And then he just starts talking about his old hobby of taxidermy, but that it's no longer his hobby. But you put the two together and you figure out he plans to taxidermy the mayor's daughter. Like, that's clearly what he's going to eventually do here. And so it's just very unsettling. And I also just love the buildup of the scene, because throughout the game, you can find the secretary's diaries where the secretary details just how insane the police chief actually is. On top of which, you can sometimes get a little fax in the STARS office where there's a report about Chief Irons as well, and the past crimes that he did before becoming police chief of Raccoon City. So it's just a really cool build up to this scene also that really is like the cherry on top of everything, along with the music and everything like that. So this is just a really cool scene that kind of gives us a different horror vibe in that moment. And I had to put it right here at number 9. At number 8, we have Resident Evil 6 with Pierce's Sacrifice. This is a hugely emotional scene. And, Resident Evil doesn't have a lot of these emotional type of scenes, but this is definitely one of the more emotional ones. Pierce was the character that you were partners with in Chris's campaign the entire time. And so you kind of got to know this character, you got to really enjoy him, and you would hope to see him in future installments. Like, he was that kind of character. But then he injects himself with the enhanced C virus to take out the Hayos, and he's just all mutated. And it doesn't look good for him. But there's still like that glimmering bit of hope that they can make it out, because Chris is determined to get him out, get him back to the surface, and return to base and figure out what they can do to save his life. And you got Chris working on opening up the escape pod. He finally gets it open, and you think, all right, we're going to get there. Until Pierce pushes Chris in there by himself and closes it behind him, leaving himself behind. It's just packed with so much emotion, because Chris is over here beating on the door, begging for Pierce to open it back up so that the two of them can escape together. But Pierce doesn't listen. Instead, he launches the pod off, allowing for Chris to escape. And then one of the coolest moments is when the Hayos shows back up, attacks the pod, and then you see the lightning from the underwater facility shoot up at Hayos and kill the BOW once and for all, allowing for Chris to rise back up to the surface. It's just such a good scene. And it's this sacrifice as to why we still have Chris today. It's why he's around in movies like Vendetta, Death Island, events like Resident Evil 7, Resident Evil 8. It's all because of the sacrifice that Pierce made. If Pierce didn't do that, they both die. And so it's a huge scene, lots of impact, and it's why I have to put it right here at number 8. It's just such a good moment. So let's go ahead and move on to number 7. At number 7, we have the original Resident Evil 4 knife fight between Leon and Krauser. This is by far the most iconic scene in the original Resident Evil 4, and I love the build-up that this scene has, where Leon enters a room by himself, supposedly, but then he gets the sense that there's someone else there with him. Pulls out his knife and quickly turns around, only to find that there's no one there. Then suddenly behind him, Krauser pulls a sneak attack off, and Leon narrowly dodges it. It is a wonderful setup, and I love the cinematics of this fight, such as when Leon and Krauser's knives lock up against each other, or near the end when they have like a little sword sparring with their knives. It's just fun little things like that you get to see throughout this knife fight, and I love seeing these two highly trained individuals go at it against each other with nothing but their knives. On top of that, their interactions are also interesting to listen to. Like, we get to see that Leon quickly picks up the fact that it was Krauser that kidnapped Ashley and brought her here. And then near the end of the fight, Krauser sort of slips up the idea of reviving Umbrella. So you get a bunch of cool things like that. The only negative thing that I could really say about this knife fight is that there are way too many quick time events throughout this whole thing. And the QTEs unfortunately cause the cutscene to freeze up for a moment so that it can load in whatever code you pushed in for the QuickTime event. And that just sort of disrupts the flow of the cutscene. I would have much rather it had just been a cutscene instead of all the QTEs sort of interrupting it. But it's a product of its time, and QTEs were a big thing during this era. And so it's unfortunate, but that's really the only real negative thing about it. Other than that, it is an iconic knife fight scene, and that is why I have it here at number 7. Let's go ahead and move on to number 6. Coming in at number 6, we have Resident Evil 6 Leon vs. Chris. This was a major selling point for Resident Evil 6, the fact that we were going to get to see the two poster children of the franchise finally cross paths and meet each other on screen canonically for the very first time. That was a huge deal. So when we finally got our hands on Resident Evil 6 and we got to this scene and we see them kind of fight each other to start things off, it was a big deal. And I love that the fight ends in a draw, like they both literally pull their guns out at each other simultaneously. And I like that it ends that way because it allows for fans of these characters to sort of debate who they really think is better for years to come. So that's really cool that it ended like that. And then, they have their little verbal argument about it's Simmons' fault, it's Ada's fault, and then all of a sudden Ada escapes, who's actually Carla Radames. And then, they go their separate ways. They talk about what their next move is going to be and how they trust each other, and they just kind of go their separate ways. So it's a very short-lived moment, but it's groundbreaking for the franchise of Resident Evil. Like, it was huge. Since Resident Evil 6, we've seen them on screen a few other times in the CGI movies of Resident Evil Vendetta and Resident Evil Death Island, but it all started right here with Resident Evil 6. So that's why I have to put it here at number 6 as one of my favorite cinematic scenes, not just for the cinematics, which are great, but also just because of how groundbreaking it was for the franchise to see these two characters on screen at the same time. So there you have it, Leon vs. Chris at number 6. Let's go ahead and move on to the top 5. To kick off the top 5, at number 5 we have the original Resident Evil 2 Ada Wong's Sacrifice from Leon Scenario B. I always loved this scene because it's packed full of so much emotion despite being a game from 1998. I love it because we see Ada come back to help Leon against the tyrant, but ultimately she ends up getting massively injured to the point where she's about to die. Leon and Ada end up having one last moment together where Ada sort of confesses her feelings for Leon, and then they kiss right before Ada passes on. And I think in this moment, personally, Paul Haddad has one of his best moments voicing Leon, where in a cry he shouts out Ada's name one last time before the scene comes to an end. And I love the little detail that right before Leon yells Ada's name, you can see his body shake where the emotions are just sort of taking over. I always like that little detail there. So like I said, this is a scene that's just packed full of so much emotion. It's the last time that these two characters will interact with each other until Resident Evil 4, and it's honestly just a shame that Resident Evil 2 Remake did not opt to use this ending in its remake. Instead, it only uses Leon Scenario A's ending where they're on the bridge, Leon catches Ada, but then ultimately has to let her go. That's not a bad ending, but I always did prefer this ending over that one, especially considering that Ada survives this whole thing, and it seems more likely that she would survive this situation as opposed to dropping 50 plus feet from the air. But regardless, this right here is absolutely a top 5 scene, and that is why I have it here at number 5. At number 4, we have the original Resident Evil 2 William Birkin's mutation scene. Being a William Birkin fan, as he is my favorite boss throughout all of Resident Evil, I absolutely love this scene because we get to learn exactly how William Birkin became the mutated monster that we would face throughout the game. I love seeing Hunk's USS team go in to retrieve the G-Virus samples. They end up gunning down Birkin, and then from that, he ends up taking the last remaining G-Virus sample and injecting it into his own body, and that's how he ends up mutating. It was a really cool thing to learn. It wasn't that he was tested on or that there was a leak. He willingly injected the G-Virus sample into his body in order to survive the gunshot wounds. So that was a really cool thing to see. And then something else that I love about this scene is that we get to learn how Raccoon City itself got infected with the T-Virus. And it's that after William Birkin mutated, he tracked down all of those guys, killed them, took the briefcase with all the samples in it, consumed the G-Virus samples within it, and caused the T-Virus samples to spill out onto the ground. That's where the rats would end up consuming it, and it would get into the water system, and that's how the whole city got infected with the T-Virus. So it's a really cool cinematic scene for not only explaining how William Birkin became to be, but also how the city became infected with this outbreak. So I love it for that. And I think my favorite moment in this scene is honestly the very end, where the last USS guy is gunning down William Birkin. He runs out of ammo, and you can just hear him breathing heavily under his mask. And then it just pans over to the William Birkin GI, and then you just hear this guy scream, and then you just see a bunch of dead bodies and the rats consuming everything. It's a really cool scene with really good music, and it explains a lot of stuff, and that's why I have it here at number 4. Coming in at number 3, we have Resident Evil 1 Remake's intro scene. This is a very well-known and iconic scene within Resident Evil, as it's where it all begins, with STAR's Alpha team going out looking for their partners in STAR's Bravo team, who went missing the night before. I absolutely love this scene because this is Resident Evil at its most pure form. Chris, Jill, they don't have this super experience that they later will have against bioweapons, zombies, zombie dogs, none of that. They are completely inexperienced with all of this at this point in the story, and you can see it clearly in the intro, where when Joseph is getting mauled by zombie dogs, Jill tries to save him by firing at all the dogs, but then runs out of ammo and falls over, to which the zombie dogs start to head for her, and Chris has to save her. They then make their way towards the mansion, and Chris turns around to see that a zombie dog is about to lunge towards him, but Wesker saves him. So in this intro, both Chris and Jill nearly get killed by mere zombie dogs, something that nowadays would be easy work for them. But at this point in the story, it's the most terrifying thing they have ever had to face. So I love the cinematics of this. I love this scene and what it represents. It's truly Resident Evil in its most pure form. And I also love how Chris is narrating in the beginning and kind of explaining everything, how they were sent out to go and investigate these instances of people who were apparently eaten. And I just love that. I mean, this is just such an iconic scene. It's by far one of the most memorable scenes within Resident Evil, and it's not as silly as the 1996 version. No, they really did fix this up and make it way more terrifying than what it was back in 96. It's going to be interesting to see if this game does end up getting another remake at some point, especially with the 30th anniversary coming up. If it does, we'll see how that intro stacks up to this one. But for now, I have this one at number 3. Okay, so for these final two scenes, you could really call them 1A, 1B, because I went back and forth as to which scene I wanted to place at number 1. But for the sake of this video, one of these scenes had to be number 2. And so with that, at number 2, we have the original Resident Evil 2, Leon and Ada's first meeting. I absolutely loved this scene because this is where my favorite two characters in the series first meet each other. And it's a really cool moment. Leon's just kind of walking through the police department parking garage where he's nearly shot, and then it turns out to be a mysterious woman in a red dress who soon reveals herself to be none other than Ada Wong. And it's a really cool moment. I love this version where Ada, her story that she's going with is that she's looking for her boyfriend John, who works for Umbrella, and she's also looking for a news reporter named Ben who may have some news on John's whereabouts. And I just like that version of the story a little bit more than what we got in the remake. Now, some people may favor the remake a bit more, and there are some aspects to the remake that I did like, such as when Ada shows up and saves Leon from the zombie dog. I think that was a really cool way of introducing her character in the remake, but there's so much nostalgia for me when it comes to the original Resident Evil 2 version of this story and of this scene, and so I have to place it at number 2 because of that. And it's also really cool just to kind of think about how these two characters meet up in this game, and then everything that they have to go through after Resident Evil 2, like Resident Evil 4, Resident Evil Damnation, the CGI movie, Resident Evil 6. Like, they go through so much stuff together, and it's kind of cool to think that it all starts right here in a parking garage of Raccoon City. And so I like that. And then on top of that, I mean, we get the famous quote of 808 moments after this scene. So lots of cool things here. Definitely have to put the introduction of my two favorite characters meeting at number 2. Let's see what we have at number 1. So whereas at number 2 I had Leon and Ada's very first meetup, naturally at number 1 I have Resident Evil 6, Leon and Ada's last farewell. This is such a good scene because this is canonically the last time that we see Leon and Ada on screen together. For Ada, she has nothing past the events of Resident Evil 6 where she appears, and for Leon, he does appear in the CGI movies Resident Evil Vendetta and Resident Evil Death Island, but Ada does not appear in either one of those films, and therefore, this scene right here is the last time that we see the two characters together. Now, hopefully that will change soon with maybe Resident Evil 9 or something, and we'll finally get to see these two characters reunite, because it's definitely time, given the fact that Resident Evil 6 is over a decade old, and the only appearances with these characters together have been remakes. So hopefully we'll get to see them reunite in something new soon enough. Something else that I do love about this scene is that throughout the scene you can hear Ada's theme from the original Resident Evil 2 softly playing in the background, and I think that's a really good touch. This is just a really cool scene of emotion where these two characters are once again going to be going their separate ways. Leon is just trying to figure out what even is Ada, why is she helping them. Ada finds it amusing that Leon is just so confused by everything, and then sends him a message about how she left him a little parting gift. And then they go their separate ways. Ada walks off, Leon shouts out Ada's name one last time, and that's pretty much the scene. I also really like how Helena tries to encourage Leon to pursue and go after Ada in this moment, but Leon instead decides to stick with Helena and escape the city with her. Probably because he knows Ada can handle herself, whereas Helena, if he doesn't stick around with her, she might not make it out. But it's a cool moment, and that's why I have it right here at number 1. Leon and Ada and their very last time seeing each other on screen. Like I said, hopefully we'll see them reunite soon enough, and maybe that scene will crack somewhere in my top 10 at some point. But for now, this is my favorite scene in Resident Evil. Well, there you have it. These are some of my favorite cinematic scenes throughout the history of the Resident Evil games. This was definitely a difficult list to come up with, even with the addition of the honorable mentions, just because of the fact that this is a franchise that next year will be 30 years old. And so with that, there's a lot of games and a lot of cinematic scenes to consider when making something like this, but I'm fairly happy with the way it came out. I think the cinematic scenes that I chose were all pretty good, even though there are several that I wish I could have included. But, that's where you can come in. What scenes would you have included? Do you agree with my list, or would your list be a little bit different? Let me know in the comments. And I think with that, I'm going to go ahead and wrap up this video here, and I shall see you all in the next one. See you then.